The wind in Bitter Creek didn't just howl, it screamed. It was the sound of a dying thing. And in the spring of 1862, everything out here on the edge of the world felt like it was dying. The town itself was a collection of splinters and lies. Buildings held up by false fronts and a prayer, leaning on each other like drunks after last call. And inside the worst of them, the Broken Wheel Saloon, Margaret Sullivan was about to die too. Maybe not her body, not yet, but her name, her dignity, her soul. Those things were on the block. 3 months. That's how long it had been since they put her husband Tom in the ground. 3 months since the official story, a Kiowa arrow on a cattle drive, had made her a widow. 3 months of ghosts, the ghost of her husband, the ghost of her old life, and the ghosts of her neighbors who looked right through her when she passed. Whispers followed her like a shadow, and the weight of their judgment was a physical thing, pressing down on her shoulders until she thought her bones would snap. Then a voice inside the saloon cut through the haze, Jake Morrison, thick with whiskey and casual cruelty. "Well, boys, seems we got ourselves a problem." Margaret's hand tightened on the doorframe, her knuckles white. She'd known this was coming. A woman alone in Bitter Creek was a broken tool, used for a bit, then tossed aside. "Widow Sullivan can't pay her debts," Morrison boomed. "Can't work her claim, and she sure as hell can't expect charity forever." The world narrowed to the dusty light inside that saloon. "I can work," she said, her own voice a stranger in her ears. It trembled, but there was a flicker of defiance in it. "I can wash, mend, cook." Morrison didn't even look at her. "Already got women for that." He was a big man, a pig in a waistcoat, his gut straining the buttons. He was the self-appointed king of this dusty little hell, and his word was the only law that mattered. He leaned back in his chair, a predator savoring the fear of his prey. "What we need," he said, letting the words hang in the air, "is to find you a permanent situation." The room went dead silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned to her. Not with pity, not with respect, with hunger. These were the same men who tipped their hats when Tom was alive. Now they looked at her like a pack of wolves that had finally cornered a wounded doe. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Morrison?" She had to force the words out, but they came out steady, colder than she felt. He stood up, the legs of his chair screaming against the floorboards. "I'm suggesting a practical solution." He smiled, and it was the ugliest thing she'd ever seen. "You need a protector, a husband of a sort, and surely one of these fine gentlemen needs a woman to keep his house in order." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "We'll conduct this proper, like an auction." The word hit her like a fist. "Auction. You can't," she whispered. I'm not property." Morrison's sneer was all yellow teeth and rot gut breath. "Ain't selling you, widow. Just settling your debts." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. "Unless you've got $60 for the rent and supplies you owe me." She didn't, and he knew it. He climbed onto a poker table, scattering cards and chips, a king on a throne of filth. "Gentlemen," he bellowed to the silent room, "the widow Sullivan, a good Christian woman, knows her place, knows how to keep a house. She's in need of a home." He looked right at her, his eyes glinting with triumph. "What am I bid?" Shame was a fire, and it was burning her alive. Her cheeks, her neck, her whole body felt like it was scorching from the inside out. Laughter, low and ugly, rippled through the room. Then a voice called out, $5. Morrison scoffed. "This ain't no crib girl, Billy. She can cook, clean. She can even read her letters. A respectable woman." Another man jeered from the back. "Can't be too respectable if she's being auctioned off like a damn milk cow." The room exploded in raucous laughter. $10 and a half-dead mule," someone shouted. "That mule's got more life in it than the widow will after a week with you, Corbin." The cruelty sharpened, each word a fresh cut. Margaret stood frozen, her dignity being flayed from her piece by piece. She was no longer a person. She was an object, a joke. 15, wheezed old Pete, a man who smelled of the grave and looked twice his 70 years. 20, said Carl Hutchkins, a man whose last 2 wives had died, Both of them tripped and fell down a flight of stairs. Funny how lightning strikes twice. Her knees felt weak. They were really doing it. They were selling her. Then someone in the back muttered it, just loud enough to hear. Trash for sale! The phrase caught on, a low chant, like a funeral dirge. Trash for sale, trash for sale, trash for sale. It was the last sound she thought she would ever hear. And then the saloon doors slammed open so hard they bounced off the walls. Every man in the room froze. Silence crashed down. A man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and there was no mistaking him. Comanche. He wore buckskin leggings and a beaded vest. A single eagle feather was tied in his long, black hair. His face was all sharp angles, carved from stone and hardship, and his eyes were like chips of flint, missing nothing. Beside him, holding his hand, was a small boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old. The boy had the same dark, serious eyes as his father. He wasn't scared. He was just watching. Comanche, someone whispered. Hands instinctively drifted towards pistols. The warrior's gaze swept across the room, past the gamblers, past the drunks, past Morrison standing on the table. His eyes landed on Margaret, and in them she didn't see pity. Pity would have broken her. She saw something else, something she couldn't name. Recognition. Morrison puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim his authority. What's your business here, Indian? This is a private matter. The Comanche warrior ignored him completely. He walked right past him, his steps silent on the dusty floorboards. He strode to the bar and placed a heavy leather pouch on the counter. The thud echoed in the silence. Then he spoke. His voice was deep, his English accented but perfectly clear. I hear you sell woman. You could have heard a pin drop. Gas rippled through the crowd. Morrison stuttered, climbing down from the table. Now see here, you got no right. The warrior cut him off, his voice flat, emotionless. You sell woman, like horse, like blanket. He looked at the men who had been chanting, his gaze sharp enough to draw blood. Like trash. He opened the pouch. Gold, not dust, not small nuggets. Solid, gleaming chunks of it. And silver coins, too. More money than most of these men would see in their lives. I take her. Chaos. Morrison's face turned purple. No savage is taking a white woman from my town, he roared. It happened faster than anyone could see. One moment, the warrior's hands were empty. The next, a knife was in his fist. He didn't throw it. He slammed it, point down, into the wooden table, right between Morrison's feet. The blade quivered, singing in the silence. Dead body can be arranged, the warrior said, his voice still calm. Deadly calm. The saloon was a powder keg, and he had just lit the fuse. Guns were half drawn. Men were frozen, caught between greed and fear. The warrior turned his back on them all, a stunning act of dominance. He looked only at Margaret. You sell woman like trash, he repeated, his voice softer now. I claim her as fire. He held out a hand, not to grab her, not to force her, an offering. You come, he said, or you stay, to be sold. The entire world hung on her answer. She looked at the faces in the crowd. Morrison's seething rage, Old Pete's lecherous grin, Carl Hutchkin's cold, calculating stare. Wolves, every last one of them. Then she looked at the warrior, a stranger, a dangerous man from a world she didn't understand. But he had offered her something no one else had, a choice, the first real choice she'd had since Tom died. I'll come, she whispered. Then louder, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. I'll come. The warrior nodded once, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He gestured to the boy. My name is Daniel Crow Feather. This is my son, Little Wolf. He looked at her, and for the first time she felt something other than fear. You are safe. And with that, the three of them turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving the gold, the silence, and the stunned faces of Bitter Creek behind them. The chant of trash for sale was finally dead. But Margaret had a feeling the trouble was just beginning. Each step away from Bitter Creek felt like a lifetime. The wind on the plains was a different kind of wind than the one in town. It was cleaner, colder, but it still carried a warning. Margaret's heart was a drum against her ribs. She was free from the auction block, but she had just walked willingly into the hands of a man who put a knife through a table without blinking. She clutched her thin shawl, watching the small boy, little Wolf, who trotted beside her. He carried himself like a tiny soldier, his dark eyes taking in everything: the sky, the rocks, her. He didn't seem afraid of her. That was something, at least. Behind them, the saloon doors were already shut, but she could feel their eyes on her back. The men of Bitter Creek would not forgive this. A Comanche warrior had shamed them, thrown gold in their faces, and walked away with a white widow. Jake Morrison would nurse that grudge like a bottle of his own cheap whiskey. He would not let it go. Daniel led them to two ponies tied at the edge of town. He handed Margaret the reins of a sturdy paint horse. "Ride," was all he said. She mounted, her skirts a clumsy tangle, her hands shaking. She'd ridden with Tom, but this was different. This was a desperate flight into the unknown. She was leaving everything behind. Her home, her church, even Tom's grave, a lonely pile of rocks she could no longer visit. They rode for miles, the only sound the creak of saddle leather and the soft thud of hooves on the dry earth. The sun began to set, bleeding red and orange across the endless sky. Finally, she couldn't stand the silence anymore. "Why?" The word was small, almost lost in the wind. Daniel glanced at her, his face a mask of stone. "Why did you do that?" she pressed, a note of desperation in her voice. "You didn't know me. You risked your life for a stranger." He reined in his horse and slowing to a walk. He looked out at the horizon, at the vast empty land that was his home. "I saw men treat you as less than a dog," he said, his voice low. "I know this pain." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were filled with an ancient sorrow. "My people have been sold, traded for guns and whiskey. White men call us savages, then burn our homes and steal our children." He held her gaze. "You were not trash. I know fire when I see it." His words struck her harder than the auctioneer's gavel. Fire. For months she had been ash, invisible, worthless, her entire existence measured by what she owed. To hear this stranger, this warrior, call her fire, it was like a spark landing in a pile of dry tinder. Something inside her, something she thought had died with Tom, flickered back to life. They made camp that night by a stream, in a grove of cottonwoods. Daniel built a fire with a quiet efficiency that spoke of 1,000 nights spent under the stars. Little Wolf gathered twigs, his small face serious in the firelight. Margaret just sat, unsure of her place, feeling useless. Daniel handed her a strip of dried venison. "Eat." She did. The smoky, salty taste was sharp on her tongue. Her hunger was a raw, aching thing, and she realized she hadn't eaten all day. As the flames danced, casting shadows that looked like giant, stalking figures, Daniel finally spoke again. His words were quiet, but they landed like stones. "You will be hunted." Margaret froze, the meat halfway to her lips. "By who?" "Those men," he said. "The fat one, Morrison. His pride is a sickness. He will not let the shame go. He will come, with guns, maybe tomorrow, maybe in a week. But he will come." A knot of ice formed in her stomach. She pictured Morrison's face, purple with rage. Daniel was right. "Then, what am I supposed to do?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "You learn," he said simply. "Learn to ride harder. Learn to shoot straighter." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "You learn to be stronger, or you die." The words weren't a threat. They were a simple, brutal fact. The law of this land. Margaret swallowed hard. She was a minister's daughter, a farmer's wife, a respectable widow, or she had been. Now what was she? She had walked out of Bitter Creek with a Comanche warrior because some deep, primal instinct told her that staying meant a different kind of death. A slow, soul-crushing death. Out here, death would be quick. That night she lay wrapped in a blanket Daniel had given her, listening to the lonely sound of the wind. Little Wolf slept curled by his father, a picture of perfect trust. She stared up at the cold, glittering stars and wondered if Tom was watching. And if he was, what he would think of her now. The next morning, Daniel woke her before the sun. Ride. And so she did. For days, they pushed deeper into the vast, unforgiving plains, deeper into Comanche territory. The old Margaret began to flake away, burned off by the relentless sun and scoured by the constant wind. She learned to cook over a fire, to find water, to move with a purpose she'd never known. She learned to ride until her legs were screaming, and then to ride some more. Little Wolf, seeing his father's acceptance of her, began to open up. He showed her how to track rabbits, how to weave tiny figures from river grass. He even started to smile at her, a shy, fleeting thing that was more precious than the gold Daniel had left on the bar. Around the fire at night, Daniel spoke of his own life, of treaties broken by men in Washington, of soldiers who came with flags of peace and left with fire and blood. His voice was heavy with sorrow, but it never broke. It was tempered with a steel-like strength. One evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple, she found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. "And the boy's mother?" Daniel's face darkened. He stared into the fire for a long time, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "She was taken," he said finally, his voice rough. "White men, raiders. They came to our winter camp. They burned. They shot." He looked away. "She did not survive." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Suddenly she understood. The shadows in his eyes. The fierce, protective way he watched over Little Wolf. The reason he had looked at her in that saloon and seen not a white woman, but another human being who was about to be destroyed by senseless cruelty. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. He just nodded once. But in that shared moment of loss, a fragile bridge was built between them. The days bled into weeks. Her skin grew brown, her hands rough, her body lean and strong. The fear was still there, a constant companion. But it was joined by something else now. Resolve. But Morrison's threat was a storm cloud on the horizon, always waiting. One night, as coyotes yipped in the distance, Margaret was scanning the vast, dark expanse, and she saw it, a flicker of light. Then another, and another. Torches. Far away, but coming closer, like a swarm of angry fireflies. She didn't have to say anything. Daniel was already on his feet, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. His voice was grim. "They come." The torches bobbed in the darkness, a pack of hungry wolves closing in. Margaret's blood ran cold. She knew who it was. The sound of their horses, a low thunder rolling across the plains, was the sound of her past coming to kill her. "It's Morrison," she whispered, her throat tight. Daniel didn't move, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. He was a coiled spring. "He brings dogs," he said, his voice a low growl. "Hungry dogs. They smell weakness." He turned to her, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "We give them steel instead." His plan was simple, and it terrified her. "Take the boy, go into the ravine, hide there. Do not make a sound until I come for you." But the word was out of her mouth before she could stop it. "No." It was quiet, but it was firm. Daniel's brow furrowed. "You are not a warrior, Margaret. You are not ready for this fight." "Then make me ready," she shot back, her own ferocity surprising her. She looked down at Little Wolf, who was clutching her skirt, his small face pale but his eyes wide with trust. In her. "If I run, they'll just hunt us down. I won't let him lose another parent, not while I can still stand." Something changed in Daniel's expression. The hardness softened, replaced by something that looked like respect. He didn't argue. He simply handed her a pistol. The weight of it was heavy and cold in her palm. It felt like death. "Keep it steady," he instructed, his voice low and urgent. "Do not waste bullets. Aim for the center, heart or head, and do not fear the sound." Her hands were trembling, but she gripped the pistol and nodded. The riders were close now, close enough to hear their cruel laughter, their drunken shouts echoing in the night. And then Morrison's voice, a familiar, hated roar. "Come on out, widow. That savage can't protect you forever. You belong in Bitter Creek. You belong to us." Daniel didn't shout back. He simply stepped out of the shadows and into the faint moonlight, his rifle held loosely at his side. He looked as ancient and unmovable as the land itself. Margaret took a deep breath and stepped out beside him. She raised the pistol with both hands to steady it. Her knees felt like they might give way, but she locked them. Daniel's voice cut through the night, as sharp and clear as a blade. Widow Sullivan is no man's property. She chose her path. You try to take her, you die first. The riders pulled up, their horses snorting and stamping in a nervous circle. Their torches threw wild, dancing shadows that made them look like demons. Morrison rode to the front, his face a twisted mask of rage in the flickering light. You think you can shame me in my own town, Comanche? He bellowed. You think you can steal what's mine? Before Daniel could answer, Margaret found her own voice. It cracked, but it carried. I was never your, she yelled, the words tearing from her throat. You treated me like trash. He treats me like fire. That's the difference. A few of the riders laughed, but it was a nervous, uncertain sound now. They had come for a helpless woman, not one who stared back at them down the barrel of a gun. Morrison's face contorted. Then you'll burn together. He raised his pistol. The night exploded in a roar of sound and fire. Daniel's rifle barked a split second before Morrison's pistol, and one of the riders to Morrison's left simply vanished from his saddle. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed and reared. Men shouted curses. Margaret squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed her shoulder, and the noise was deafening. But she saw a man clutch his arm and fall from his horse. Smoke stung her eyes. She felt Little Wolf press against the back of her legs, and a wave of pure, cold fury washed over her. She fired again. A man screamed. Daniel was a phantom in the smoke and shadows. He moved with a deadly grace, each shot precise, each bullet finding a home. Two more riders fell, their torches tumbling into the dry grass, which instantly caught fire. Flames began to lick their way across the plains, adding to the hellish scene. But Morrison wasn't a rider anymore. He was a force of nature, a bellowing bull, pushing forward through the chaos. He leveled his pistol and fired. Daniel cried out and staggered back. A dark stain was spreading across his side. No! Margaret screamed. The fear vanished, replaced by a white-hot rage she had never known. She saw nothing but Morrison. She raised her pistol, the barrel strangely steady now. She aimed through tears and smoke, and she fired. The bullet hit Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him around. His pistol flew from his grasp. You worthless wench! He shrieked, his eyes wide with disbelief and pain. You'd choose him over your own kind? Margaret's voice was low, trembling with the aftermath of violence, but her words were like steel. I choose the one who sees me as human. That was the moment the fight broke. Without Morrison's leadership, the rest of the riders were just thugs. Their courage shattered. Some turned and fled into the darkness. The few that remained were quickly dispatched by Daniel's steady aim. Finally, an eerie silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the spreading fire and the groans of wounded men. Morrison was on his knees in the dirt, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face a canvas of pure hatred. This ain't over, he spat, blood dripping from his lips. The whole territory will hear about this. A white woman shacked up with a savage. They'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. Daniel walked over to him, his steps heavy. He raised his rifle, the barrel aimed squarely at Morrison's forehead. Margaret held her breath. For a long moment, the world stood still. Then Daniel lowered the rifle. Not worth the bullet, he said, his voice cold with contempt. You are already dead inside. He turned his back on the groveling man and walked to Margaret. He took her trembling hand, the one still holding the pistol, and gently took the weapon from her. With Little Wolf clinging to her skirt, they walked back towards the light of their small campfire, turning their backs on the darkness and the dying. Morrison's curses followed them, but they were just noise now. They had no more power. As soon as they reached the fire, Daniel's strength gave out. He sank onto a log, his face pale, his hand pressed against the bloody wound in his side. Margaret fell to her knees beside him. She ripped a long strip from the hem of her skirt without a second thought, balling it up and pressing it hard against the bleeding. Her hands shook, but her mind was clear. You saved me, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. He looked at her, his eyes weary, but burning with an inner light. No, he said, his voice strained. You saved yourself, and you saved the boy. He reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek. You are stronger than you know, Margaret. You are fire. And that was when the tears finally came. Tears of fear, of relief, of grief for the woman she had been, and awe for the woman she was becoming. She had been sold like trash. She had fought like a warrior. Little Wolf curled up against her, his small hand finding hers in the dark. Daniel's gaze rested on them, and it was a look of profound connection. He didn't see a white woman he had rescued. He saw his partner. He saw his family. Margaret looked out at the burning plains, at the endless, dangerous world that lay ahead. It was a world full of hunters and whispers, but for the first time since Tom died, she wasn't afraid, and she wasn't alone. But as she tended to Daniel's wound, a strange detail from the fight surfaced in her mind. Morrison had screamed, "You think you can steal what's mine?" He hadn't said, "Who's mine?" He'd said, "What's mine?" It was a small thing, a slip of the tongue in the heat of battle, unless it wasn't. Days later, Daniel was still weak. The bullet had gone clean through, but he'd lost a lot of blood, and fever was his constant companion. They found a small hidden cave behind a waterfall, a place where they could rest and heal, shrouded from the world by a constant curtain of water. Margaret hunted, small game mostly. She used the skills Daniel had begun to teach her, her hands growing steady, her eye growing sharp. She foraged for edible roots and herbs to fight the fever, just as he'd shown her. She was the protector now. She and Little Wolf were a team. He would stand watch at the mouth of the cave while she was gone, a tiny, solemn guardian. During the long hours while Daniel slept, Margaret's mind churned. What's mine? The words wouldn't leave her alone. Morrison wasn't a man driven by lust. He was driven by greed. He hadn't wanted her for her company. He'd wanted her because she was a means to an end. But what end? Her claim was worthless. The small plot of land Tom had bought was rocky and barren. One afternoon, as Daniel's fever finally broke and his eyes were clear for the first time in days, she asked him, "Daniel, when you came to the saloon, had you ever seen me before?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the waterfall outside the cave. "No," he said, "but I had heard your name." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "From who?" "From your husband." The world tilted on its axis. "You knew Tom?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Not well. We met only twice. He was not like the other white men. He did not look at my people with hate or fear. He looked at us with respect. He was trying to do something good." A cold dread washed over her. What was he doing? "He was carrying a message," Daniel said, his voice low. "A document, a treaty, signed by a general back east. It was a promise that this land, the land of the Pennateca Comanche, would be ours, forever, protected by your laws." It all started to click into place, the jagged pieces of a puzzle she didn't even know she was solving. Tom was bringing that treaty to your chief? Yes, it was the only thing that could stop men like Morrison. He and his partners, they know there is gold in our sacred hills. They have been trying to drive us out for years. This treaty would have been a wall they could not break. Daniel's eyes grew dark. Your husband was a brave man. He knew the risk. And suddenly, she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. His death, she whispered. It wasn't a Kiowa arrow, was it? Daniel looked at her, his expression grim. The Kiowa have not raided that far south in a generation. It was a lie. Tom was murdered, Margaret. He was murdered for the paper he was carrying. The story she had mourned for 3 months was a fabrication, a cruel lie to cover up a murder. Tom hadn't been a victim of chance. He'd been assassinated, and Morrison had been at the heart of it. That's what he'd wanted. Not her, the treaty. He must have thought Tom had given it to her for safekeeping. The auction? It wasn't about $60. It was a charade, a way to get his hands on her, to get her alone and torture her until she told him where it was. Her blood ran cold. He hadn't just tried to sell her, he was going to kill her. But he didn't find it, she said, her mind racing. Tom's body was brought back to town by the sheriff. They said they found nothing on him. Morrison must believe you have it, Daniel said. That is why he will not stop hunting you. As long as he thinks that paper exists, you are a threat to his fortune. Margaret racked her brain, trying to remember the last conversation she'd had with Tom. He'd been nervous, distracted. He'd kissed her goodbye and told her he was doing something important, something that would make a better future for them. He'd told her to keep his things, his saddlebags, his spare clothes, and his journal, a small leather-bound book he always carried. She'd never read it. She felt it was his private space. After he died, she had packed it away in her trunk, unable to bear the sight of his familiar handwriting. She still had it. It was back in her cabin, the cabin that Jake Morrison now owned. He gave me something, she said, her voice barely a whisper. A book, a journal. Daniel sat up, ignoring the pain in his side. His eyes were wide with a new, urgent intensity. Where is this book? It's back there, she said, the words tasting like ash. It's in Bitter Creek. For a long moment, they stared at each other, the same impossible thought passing between them. Going back was a suicide mission, but the journal was the only proof. It was the only way to expose Morrison, the only way to get justice for Tom, and the only way to save Daniel's people. It was the only way this ended. We have to go back, she said, the words solidifying the insane plan in her own mind. Daniel nodded slowly, a grim smile touching his lips. I told you, he said softly. I know fire when I see it. The huntress was about to go back into the wolf's den, but this time she had teeth of her own. The journey back towards Bitter Creek was a tense, silent crawl. They moved only at night, sticking to the shadows, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Every rock, every twisted tree looked like a man with a rifle. The closer they got, the heavier the air felt. Margaret's old life was there, just over the next rise. A life of church socials and mending clothes. It felt like it belonged to another person, a person who was now dead and buried, just like Tom. Daniel was still not at full strength, but he pushed himself, his face a mask of grim determination. He knew the stakes. One night, as they rested their horses in a deep arroyo, he spoke. When we get there, it will not be simple. Morrison will have watchers on every road. I know the town, Margaret said. I know the back ways. My cabin is at the edge of town, near the creek. I can get in. And get the book. But then what? We cannot simply ride away. They will be on us in minutes. He was right. They needed more than the journal. They needed to use it. The sheriff, Margaret said, thinking of Sheriff Brody, a quiet, tired-looking man who had always seemed decent. He had been the one to bring Tom's body back. He had looked her in the eye and expressed his condolences. He's the law. If I show him what's in the journal, if it proves Tom was murdered. Daniel looked skeptical. The law in these towns often serves the man with the most money. But we have to try, she insisted. It's our only chance. Their plan was desperate. Margaret would slip into town under the cover of a moonless night, retrieve the journal, and take it directly to Sheriff Brody. Daniel and Little Wolf would wait with the horses at a prearranged spot just outside of town. If she wasn't back by sunrise, he was to take his son and ride far away and never look back. She made him promise. The night they reached the outskirts of Bitter Creek, Margaret's heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of her chest. The town was a collection of weak yellow lights in the oppressive darkness. It looked smaller than she remembered, weaker. She shed her buckskins and put on the worn gingham dress she still had in her saddlebags. She pulled her shawl over her head, trying to look like any other woman, a ghost slipping through the streets of her own pass. Leaving Daniel and Little Wolf hidden in the rocks was the hardest thing she'd ever done. Be safe, Daniel whispered, his hand gripping her arm. She just nodded, unable to speak, and melted into the darkness. The town was quiet. Drunken shouts from the broken wheel were the only signs of life. She crept through back alleys, her feet silent on the hard-packed dirt. The smells, stale beer, horse manure, coal smoke, were sickeningly familiar. Her cabin looked exactly as she had left it, a dark, lonely shape against the night sky. The front door was locked, but she knew the kitchen window latch was broken. She slipped inside, her breath held tight in her lungs. The air was stale, filled with the ghosts of her old life. She could almost smell Tom's pipe tobacco, almost hear his heavy footsteps on the floorboards. Her trunk was at the foot of the bed. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. And there it was, the small, leather-bound journal. She grabbed it, her fingers closing around it like a lifeline. She was about to turn and flee when she heard it, a floorboard creaking. On the front porch, she froze, her blood turning to ice. A key scraped in the lock. The front door swung open. A man stepped inside, holding a lantern. It wasn't Morrison, it was Sheriff Brody. He saw her in the same instant she saw him. His eyes widened, not in surprise, but in a kind of weary frustration. "Margaret," he sighed as if he'd been expecting her. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you?" Behind him, two more men stepped into the cabin, blocking the door. They worked for Morrison. She recognized their cruel, empty faces from the saloon. Her mind reeled. Daniel had been right. The law was bought and paid for. The sheriff took a step towards her. "Give me the book, Margaret. It'll be easier on you if you do." "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice shaking with betrayal. "You told me it was a Kiowa arrow. You looked me in the eye and you lied." The sheriff's face hardened. Tom was a fool. He got involved in things that were none of his business. He chose his side. Now I'm not asking again. The journal. She clutched the book to her chest. "It's all in here, isn't it? Everything. The murder. The plan to steal the Comanche land. It's all in his own words." Brody actually smiled, a cold, dead thing. "That's why it's so important we get it back." She backed away, her eyes darting around the small cabin, looking for an escape she knew wasn't there. The kitchen window. Too far. "Morrison won't get away with this," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. The sheriff chuckled. Morrison? Morrison is just the money. This is bigger than him. There are important men back east who want that land. Men who don't like complications." He gestured to the journal. "And you, Margaret, have become a very big complication." One of the thugs started to move towards her. She did the only thing she could think of. She ran, not for the door, for the fireplace. With a scream of defiance, she threw the journal into the cold, dark hearth. She grabbed the oil lamp from the mantelpiece, twisted off the top, and hurled the oil onto the book. Then she grabbed the box of matches. "No!" Brody screamed, lunging for her. But he was too late. She struck a match, the small flame, a defiant star in the darkness. She held it over the oil-soaked journal. "It all burns," she said, her voice ringing with a wild power. "Or you let me walk out of here. Your choice." The sheriff and his men froze, their faces illuminated by the tiny flickering flame. They were caught in a standoff, her life against their fortune. But then a new voice came from the darkened doorway, a voice that made her blood run cold. "That's not your only choice, Sheriff." Jake Morrison stepped into the room. He was holding a rifle, and it was aimed directly at her head. "You can shoot her," he said with a greasy smile, "and I can pull the book out of the fire myself." The tiny flame of the match trembled in Margaret's hand. Her bluff was called. Sheriff Brody looked from the match to the journal to Morrison's rifle. Greed and fear wrestled on his face. "Don't be a fool, Morrison," Brody hissed. "If that book burns, if she walks out of here, we all hang," Morrison countered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I'm not losing everything because of some stubborn widow." Margaret's mind was racing. This was it, the end of the line. She could drop the match and let them have the book, or she could drop it in the fireplace and die. But then she thought of Daniel and Little Wolf, waiting for her in the darkness. She had made a promise. A sudden, desperate idea flared in her mind, an idea born of pure fire and instinct. "You're right, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. She looked at Sheriff Brody. "He's right. You can't let me leave, but you can't let the book burn either." She blew out the match. The room plunged back into semi-darkness, lit only by the lantern at the door. She reached down and picked up the oil-soaked journal. "So here's the deal," she said, her voice ringing with authority. She held the book out. "You give me one horse and a full canteen. You let me ride out of here, and you give me a 1-hour head start. No one follows. After an hour, I'll leave the journal on the trail for you to find." Morrison laughed. You think we're idiots? You'll take the book and run. Maybe, she said, looking him dead in the eye. But what choice do you have? If you shoot me, the book could be damaged. If I fight, I'll throw it in the fire. This is the only way you get what you want, and I get what I want. It was a crazy gamble, a whisper-thin chance. Brody looked at Morrison. He was the lawman, but Morrison held the power. Morrison stared at her, his little pig eyes calculating. He wanted that book. He wanted it more than he wanted her dead. 1 hour, he finally growled. But if that book ain't where you say it will be, I'll hunt you down, and what I do to you will make the auction look like a church picnic. You understand? Perfectly, she said. They marched her to the stables. One of Morrison's men held a gun to her back, while another saddled a horse. They gave her a canteen. As she mounted, Morrison grabbed the bridle, his face inches from hers. You're not as clever as you think you are, widow. And you're not as powerful as you think you are. Saloon keeper, she shot back. She kicked the horse and galloped out of town, the journal clutched in her hand. She didn't look back. She rode hard, not west towards the plains, but north, along the creek. It was the last direction they'd expect. Every sound was a gunshot. Every shadow was a rider. The hour felt like a lifetime. She found the spot where she was supposed to meet Daniel. It was empty. Panic seized her. Had he left? Had he thought she was caught? But then she saw it. A sign he had taught her. 3 small stones, stacked one on top of the other. It was a Comanche trail marker. It meant, I am moving. Follow this direction. A wave of relief washed over her. He was alive. He was smart. He knew the plan had gone wrong, and he was leading her away. She followed the trail of markers, her heart pounding with a strange mix of terror and hope. Just before the sun began to bleed across the horizon, she found them, hidden in a thicket of mesquite. Daniel's face was a mask of relief when he saw her. He grabbed her in a fierce hug, and for a moment, she let herself collapse against him. I thought you were gone, he whispered. They were waiting for me, she said, her voice trembling. Brody, the sheriff. He's with them. She showed him the journal. But I have it. I have the proof. He took the book, his eyes grim. Then the hunt is truly on now. They will not stop. I know, she said. I told them I'd leave it for them. When they find out I lied, they'll come with everything they have. They had to run, but where? The plains were too open. They would be tracked and surrounded. Then Daniel looked at the journal in his hands and then back at her. A new plan was forming in his eyes, a plan even more dangerous than the last. They are hunting us, he said, so we will hunt them. Margaret stared at him. What do you mean? They think we are running west, away from their world, but we will not. He pointed east, towards the territorial capital, 100 miles away. The treaty was signed by a general. There is a fort there. There are soldiers. Real law. We will take this book to them. We will take the fight to their world. It was insane. It was a long, desperate ride through hostile territory, with Morrison and his killers on their trail. But it was also brilliant. They would never expect it. Margaret looked at Little Wolf, sleeping soundly, and then at Daniel, his face resolute in the pre-dawn light. She had walked out of Bitter Creek a victim. She had returned a thief. Now she would ride out as a messenger of justice. Okay, she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. Let's go see the general. But as they prepared to ride, Daniel opened the journal. He read a few pages of Tom's frantic scrawl. His face went pale. Margaret, he said, his voice low and urgent. This is worse than we thought. What is it? He pointed to a passage in the book. The gold in the hills. Morrison doesn't just want to mine it. He has already sold the rights to the railroad. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't about a small-town saloon owner's greed. This was about the railroad, about progress, about the kind of money that could buy governors and generals. And, Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper, the man who brokered the deal, the man coming to inspect the land in 2 days, is General Gideon Wells. The same general who had signed the treaty. The man they were riding to for help. He wasn't their savior. He was the final boss. The world seemed to shrink around them. The one man who represented their last hope was at the center of the entire conspiracy. They were utterly, completely alone. What do we do? Margaret's voice was a dry whisper. The weight of the revelation was crushing. They weren't just fighting a corrupt saloon owner anymore. They were fighting the future. They were fighting the United States itself. Daniel stared at the journal, his knuckles white. The name of General Wells was written there, clear as day, in Tom's hand. Tom had discovered the truth just before he was killed. He hadn't been riding to the Comanche. He'd been riding to the nearest telegraph station to try and expose the whole thing. We cannot go to the fort, Daniel said, his voice grim. We would be walking into our own graves. So we run? The word tasted like defeat. We let them win? Let them take your land and get away with murdering my husband? No, Daniel said, a dangerous light in his eyes. We do not run. We change the battlefield. He looked out at the rising sun, a plan taking shape. The general is coming here to inspect the land, to meet with Morrison and Brody, to finalize the deal. They will take him to the hills, to the place where the gold is. He pointed to a series of rugged, towering mesas in the distance. The hills of the sleeping ancestors, Daniel said, our most sacred place. A cold fury settled over Margaret. They were going to sign their filthy deal on sacred ground. We can't fight a general and his soldiers, she said. No, Daniel agreed. We will not fight them with guns. We will fight them with the truth. His plan was the most audacious gamble yet. They would get ahead of Morrison's party. They would intercept the general, not on the road, but in the sacred hills themselves. They would confront him there, surrounded by the spirits of Daniel's ancestors, and force him to look at the truth written in a dead man's hand. It was a plan with 1,000 ways to fail, but it was the only plan they had. They rode like the wind, pushing their horses to the limit. They knew the land better than Morrison's men. Daniel led them through hidden canyons and dry riverbeds, a path that was invisible to any trackers. As they rode, Margaret read the journal. She learned more about her husband in those frantic, ink-stained pages than she had in 5 years of marriage. She saw his decency, his outrage at the injustice he had uncovered, and his fear. He knew he was a marked man. His last entry was chilling. Met with Brody today. Told him I was concerned about Morrison's activities. He told me not to worry. He said he would handle it. But the way he looked at me, I don't think I can trust him. I ride for Fort Grant at dawn. God help me. He had ridden right into an ambush, set up by the man he'd gone to for help. The grief was a fresh, sharp pain in her chest, but it was tempered by a cold, hard resolve. She wasn't just fighting for Daniel's people anymore. She was fighting for Tom, for his memory, for his justice. They reached the hills of the sleeping ancestors the next day. The place was breathtaking. Red rock formations twisted towards the sky like giant, silent sentinels. It was a natural cathedral, and Margaret could feel the power, the history humming in the air. They found a high ledge that overlooked the trail leading into the heart of the hills. From here, they could see anyone coming for miles. They didn't have to wait long. Late in the afternoon, a column of riders appeared. At the front were Morrison and Sheriff Brody. Behind them, a dozen armed thugs. And in the center, riding a fine black stallion, was an officer in a crisp blue uniform, his chest gleaming with medals. General Gideon Wells. They watched as the party rode into the main canyon below and dismounted. Morrison was talking animatedly, pointing at the canyon walls, no doubt describing the veins of gold that lay within. The general listened, nodding, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. This was their moment. Daniel turned to Margaret. Are you ready? She looked at Tom's journal in her hands. She thought of the auction, the trash for sale chant, the fight on the plains, the terror in the cabin. It had all led to this. Yes, she said. They left Little Wolf hidden in a small cave, with strict instructions not to make a sound. Then they began their descent. They didn't approach from the trail. They climbed down the steep canyon face using handholds and footholds that only a Comanche would know. They emerged from the rocks 50 feet from the assembled group, appearing as if from the earth itself. Daniel held his rifle. Margaret held the journal. The first one to see them was one of Morrison's thugs. His jaw dropped. What in the... Every head turned. Morrison's face went from triumph to pure, undiluted rage. Sheriff Brody's hand went to his gun, but General Wells just looked curious, amused even. Well, well, the general said, his voice smooth and condescending. What do we have here? A little local color? General Wells, Margaret said, her voice clear and strong, echoing off the canyon walls. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and this book belonged to my husband. She held up the journal. Before these men, she said, pointing at Morrison and Brody, murdered him. The general's smile faltered. He looked at Morrison, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He hated complications. These are serious accusations, madam, the general said. And this is the proof, she said, taking a step forward. It's all in here. The original treaty you signed, the illegal deal you made with the railroad, the conspiracy to steal this land, and the orders to kill anyone who got in the way. It's all in my husband's hand. Morrison finally found his voice. She's lying. She's a hysterical woman who ran off with a savage. Am I? Margaret said, her gaze locked on the general. Then read it for yourself. See if Tom Sullivan's signature matches the one on the Army documents you have in your saddlebags. The general was no fool. He could see this was unraveling, fast. His reputation, his career, was contained in that little leather book. Sheriff, the general said, his voice now cold as ice. Arrest these two. Brody drew his pistol. You heard him. Drop the rifle. But Daniel just smiled, a slow, chilling smile. You are fools to come to this place, Daniel said, his voice low and resonant. This is the land of our ancestors. They are watching. The only thing watching you is the buzzards that'll be picking your bones, Morrison snarled. And then a sound that made the hair on Margaret's arm stand on end. A high, ululating cry from the top of the canyon rim. It was answered by another and another. General Wells, Morrison, and all their men looked up. Lining the canyon rim, silhouetted against the sky, were dozens of figures, Comanche warriors, on horseback, armed with rifles and bows. They had appeared from nowhere, as silent as the spirits Daniel had spoken of. Little Wolf had done his job. He had alerted the village. Morrison's party was trapped, utterly surrounded. The tables hadn't just turned. They had been smashed to pieces. The general stared up at the warriors, then back at Daniel and Margaret. The smugness was gone, replaced by a dawning horror. He had been caught in his own trap. You see, General, Margaret said, her voice ringing with the power of absolute justice. My husband's story didn't die with him. She opened the journal. And now, everyone is going to hear it. The canyon fell silent, waiting for the truth to finally be spoken. The wind whispered through the rocks, carrying the promise of a reckoning that had been a long time coming. If this story of courage and justice moved you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one.